Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us once again on this wonderful Sunday of, what is the date today? It's let me check. The way that I am so busy these days, I'm even struggling to meet up the dates. I don't even know what date. It's the 12th of February, 2023. Time flies. Welcome and thank you very much for joining us. It's Pont de Politique. Welcomes you and appreciates your presence in being part of this platform once again this wonderful Sunday. If you are new in this platform, here is the details. Pont de Politique on YouTube. Make sure that you subscribe so that we can expand our community. We are also having the community and the followers that are following us on Twitter, retweet and follow us and make sure that you watch wherever you are. Another platform that is available for Pont de Politique is Facebook. We are equally available. We are broadcasting live on Facebook as we speak at this moment. We are also available on Instagram and TikTok. If you are unable to understand what are we talking about in this program, we are Pont de Politique. It is a French name that is, when it is translated to a bridge to politics. Why the choice of a French name instead of any other name? Why did you choose the name, the French name? The idea was not in the name per se, or the language of the name per se. The idea was in the essence of the name, which is a bridge to politics. For some people, they refer to it as politics 101. So for us, we're calling it a bridge to politics. Why are we calling it a bridge to politics? Majority of people, especially in Southern Africa, have been so disgruntled by the way that politics have been made. Politics have been engaged in, the way that politicians have been politicking, to a point that majority of people have become disgruntled. That is one. Number two, the other people who are in the Southern Africa and the world, they do not understand majority of the things that the politicians tend to talk about, because politicians tend to speak similarly like academics at some point. They either speak above the people or they hide certain things behind meanings and behind words. And the popular media, the mass media, also in South Africa, has not been kind in promoting an understanding of politics, political concepts, and political analysis in South Africa. So much that the majority of the information that is put into the public media tends to be a specific narrative. Not that there's anything wrong to a specific narrative, but the problem of that one narrative is that the other narratives are not allowed space of expression. And Pont de Politique was therefore established for that particular purpose, to ensure that there is another narrative that is put out there for people to be able to consume anything that relates to politics, political concepts, and political understanding. That was the reason why we had opted for Pont de Politique, the bridge to politics. For some people, it could be politics 101. Secondly, most of the time, the majority of podcasts that take place out there, they tend to speak little about analyzing the politics of the day and the concepts, the philosophical framings, the historicity of certain things. And most of those podcasts, they tend to get edited. Yeah, they get edited for the purposes of making sure that sometimes certain things are taken out of the video. Sometimes certain things are being promoted and all that. When the Politik had opted for a different approach, that everything that we say it is raw. We only edit after. So it is a live podcast. It is a live program. It is a live webinar of some sort. It is not edited in any way. That's what makes it, one, more advantageous. Two, it allows anybody. We might disagree about the ideas. We might have different views, but we allow almost everybody to be part and parcel of the conversation. Now that we understand those things, if you are watching for the first time, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and tell your friends and their friends, tell your family and their families and everybody else to subscribe to Bond the Politik on YouTube so that we can grow the family. Now, when we will be talking today with our guest, I want you to make your comments, your questions as any time as possible, any way as you like. We would love to have you participating in this conversation. Our guest is going to be available in a minute or so. Immediately when he's available, we will start our program because he was being highlighted as on stage 3 or stage 4 or stage 5, whatever the stages are, of blackouts titled as load shedding. So we are going to be having a conversation with Greg Mackenzie. Greg Mackenzie is having ideas around the issue of whiteness in post-apartheid South Africa. Let me give you a quick background. South Africa as a political state, as a political construct, as a political society, was established under the colonial or racist undertones that were aligned to white supremacy, where European settlers came into this part of the continent and other colonies, and therefore took over these particular societies. One of those societies was or is South Africa. By 1910, there was a consolidation between the two European groups, the Dutch and the British, against the native Africans who were in the southern part of Africa. And then there was an establishment of what is called South Africa. That union was therefore made manifest with the Union of South Africa in 1910. So throughout the years from the first arrival of the Europeans in South Africa up until 1994, the political phenomena, the social culture, the economy, and everything else was always underpinned by these elements of racial undertones that were defined by those people who regarded themselves as white people, that is, Europeans. So now, today, we are going to be talking about whiteness in post-apartheid South Africa. What is post-apartheid South Africa? It is a South Africa that has been re-established after 1994. And our guest today is going to be taking us through that particular conversation. Thank you to Vuyo Danster, who is greeting us. And she says she's watching from Komani in the Eastern Cape. Let's welcome our guest today. Greg, my friend, how are you?
I'm good, Ernie. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thanks for joining us, my friend. I know that I know that you were on what stage 3 or 4 of load shedding, whatever the case might be, and yes, we appreciate that you had to come through. You are going to come here and talk about a very interesting dynamic and a very interesting conversation.
Yeah.
And we had spoken about it at some point.
Yeah.
We had spoken about it at some point. Yeah. Before we can go to the essence of the conversation, where are you from? Where is Greg from in the part of the world?
So I'm from KZN in South Africa, and I'm now in Cape Town, doing masters. But yeah, I grew up in a town just above Pietermaritzburg called Hilton, which was quite a affluent town, I suppose one would say. Although after looking at the property market in Cape Town, I have second thoughts. Cape Town is stupidly expensive. But yeah, so that's me. I'm in philosophy. I've been studying philosophy for a while now, and I'm working my master's in philosophy, and I'm very interested in phenomenology and existentialism, especially applied into the context. Yeah, so that's sort of Greg at a brief glance.
Yeah. So currently, Greg, you are in Western Cape, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
how do you find Western Cape? How do you find Western Cape in its generality?
Well, I mean, the ocean is nice. I don't know. That's the most raving review. No, it's very nice. It's good. I do miss the hills and the mists of the Midlands, but that's that's just me being a homebody. But yeah, it's nice. It's expensive. It's totally different. It's a cultural shift, which has been quite interesting for my research actually. To see, perhaps whiteness isn't just one universal thing, but there are many types of whitenesses, so to say, which I'm sure we can get into later. But yeah, so it's Cape Town is Cape Town. It's the usual reviews. Yeah. Although the students are so loud, that's my negative. These first years
they are different. They are different to who? To which students? The students in Gauteng.
I don't know. Maybe I'm just old now, but if they could go to bed at 10 o'clock and not make noise after 10 p.m., that would be appreciated.
How is that possible for students to go to bed at 10?
I don't think it is possible. It's not, but we can live in hope.
Thanks for joining us, my friend. And already there's Tatum who says, "Go, Greg," and already there's a person who seems to be following our conversation. Yeah.
Thank you, Tatum.
Yeah, Greg, you have made some thoughts around the issue of whiteness in post-apartheid South Africa. Yes. Before we can just even go to the element of whiteness, from your description, how do you think about post-apartheid South Africa? It helps the viewers to understand what you are saying about post-apartheid South Africa.
So I think your outline was quite good at the start, mentioning that I think I'm not sure if this was called the Republic of South Africa, but it was a European sort of colony, and then I don't know if you call it, but I know the Boer Afrikaans independence, from what I understand, and then obviously a few years on in Afrikaans independence, and then this new regime called apartheid starts to emerge. I think is very, I think that's a rough and ready sort of quick history. And obviously we all know apartheid in its structural composition, where you have a system which is specifically designed toward the exclusion and exploitation of non-white for white benefit. That's Biko's. I think that's Biko's way of defining apartheid. I think that's the way to define apartheid. And now post-apartheid, we're apparently in a situation where race isn't a question anymore. If you have a disparity in post-apartheid South Africa, it's apparently, I say apparently, obviously to indicate some suspicion here, apparently it's not because of race. Apparently, schools are not funded in a racially disparate manner. Apparently, your race doesn't make a difference as to what your opportunities are and what your treatments, how you are treated in South Africa. Apparently, so post-apartheid South Africa is now, so the slogan is, we don't care about race anymore. But, obviously that's not the case, because there are documents, there are lots of reports of racially disparate funding, of racially charged incidents, and so on. So how do I define post-apartheid South Africa? Well, apparently we don't care about race anymore, in brackets, but we still do, really. That's sort of how I define it.
And so for you, these are things that are apparently in thinking, but in reality you're saying they're there. And then you talk about whiteness for the purposes also of clarification. what do you mean by whiteness? Can you just unpack that for us so that we can then be able to understand these two concepts that you're talking about?
So there's a few ways to understand whiteness. The one way is as a structural composition of society, which works as following the Biko quote. One way to understand whiteness is as whiteness refers to a structural composition of society or an organization or institution which is structured such that it works to the benefit of whites at the expense of non-whites. So when someone says, if someone says, for example, there's a book, I think it's something Whiteness in South Africa, and it looks at the Western Cape education departments, and it says in this book, they say, okay, well, one way of thinking about whiteness is as this thing which refers to this racially disparate funding. So this book records incidents where, one school, which is a model former C school, or one which is quite a white school, so to say, is given a lot more funding than more rural schools where it's majority black students. So they even have in this book, there's even an incident of, there's a Western Cape Western Cape Education Department inspector, I think, at one of the poorer schools, which is majority black, and there's holes in the classroom, and the inspector is there, sort of ticking the boxes, not really reporting the accuracy of the situation. So I'm not entirely sure what's going on with the inspector there, but we could say that power dynamic wherein, okay, well, there's this way in which weird mechanism in which white schools get more funding from Western Cape Education Department than majority black schools. We'd say, okay, well, that's whiteness. So that's one way of understanding whiteness as an institutional pattern or flow. The other way of understanding whiteness is as sort of a personal thing, in that it's a way of disclosing the world. It's a way of relating to the world. It's a way of being in the world. Now, those are obviously some Heideggerian terms there. But let me put it this way, right? So one way to think about whiteness is when you are, okay, let me start the sentence again. So when you are at your grandfather's house and you inhabit that house, you're quite familiar with it. You know how to get around with it. You inhabit that house. You live out that space, right? Because you say you want a glass of gin and tonic, you know where your grandfather keeps the good gin, you know where he keeps the tonic, so you go and help yourself. You can take up that space. It's your, you need to go to the bathroom, so you just sort of go to the bathroom. It's the way you inhabit that space, right? When you inhabit that space, it's a way of doing something. It's inhabiting as a verb. So, well, one way to think of whiteness might be as a way of inhabiting a space, right? And we could say that space is South Africa. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that the way I inhabit the world is a way which affirms or perpetuates or takes for granted some ideas of white superiority. Okay, what do I mean by white superiority? Well, the easiest way to define that is to use Biko, where he says the idea that one race is, on top, superior to the other. And that's why, Odie, it's interesting that you mentioned the formation of South Africa, because the formation of South Africa definitely lent into what is called a European master narrative, wherein the white European is the absolute master. They make the world go round. They make history. Without the white, no one could be anything, because the white is what makes the world go round. So that was in the European context, in European colonization. And now we sort of see the same sort of narrative has now shifted into a way of being in the world, if that makes sense. So when I say way of being, well, let's take, for example, the July 2021 riots. So there at those riots, we all know barricades formed, right? The town that I was in, there were certainly a lot of barricades, and they were just manned by white people. It was a lot of white people with a lot of guns. I mean, one guy had like 2 pistols and a rifle, and I thought, you can't shoot 3 guns at once. So I don't know. But he was, and there was a sense of they were definitely racially profiling. Not everyone at the barricades are doing it, but we'll just use this generalization for now. But there was a definite sense of racial profiling there was a sense of, we almost want the black other to come in a sense. There was definitely a sense of that master narrative again of the essential absolute against the lesser other. And that's why, you were at that barricade and you got a sense that these guys were being hostile towards non-whites because they, that's immediately they were the the other, they wanted to be hostile, they wanted that violence. So in a way, when I say want, what I'm trying to actually say is the way they see the value. So let's say they set a barricade around a grocery store. They might say, well, the value we are trying to bring about here, which we are trying to act upon, trying to rarefy, I think is the right word, is to is the value of public safety, because we're trying to apparently guard this public space. But now the way that these people see that value, the way they move toward the value, the way they understand that value, how they elaborate that value, that disclosing of the value, right? That's done in a way which we would say is whiteness. Why? Well, because it's done in such a way which tends to reflect the idea that European master narrative. It tends to reflect the idea of white superiority. So they disclose this value, public safety, in an incredibly racial way. So that link of disclosing something in this sort of way, that pattern is one other way of thinking about whiteness, which is often said to be engendered by a society which is structurally composed such that it benefits whites at the expense of non-whites, right? So in other words, we have two senses of whiteness. One's a structural composition, the other one's a way of disclosing, a way of seeing or thinking or relating to the world. And that second one is engendered by the first one.
Okay. So both of them, they are interrelated. It cannot be, according to your thinking, they should not be isolated.
Yeah. So that's so the main thing is here. There's a theorist, Melissa Stein, and who writes about the master narrative connection. Shannon Sullivan, who sort of bridges this gap, and some other people like Sarah Ahmed and Steve Biko. Obviously, in the South African context, is almost the pioneer of how is race a way of disclosing or being. But yeah, so these guys and women, they link this together. So the society engenders whiteness, but your personal whiteness can also then compound the whiteness of that society. And if you think about it, it makes sense, right? So for example, when these so let's take Afri-Forum, for example, right? So now they are, I read that they're in a legal battle over displaying the apartheid flag because they contest that it's not actually hate speech. So, well, if we could say that that was a type of whiteness and it was engendered by society, then we could probably, if we took that for granted for now, I have a way of arguing that that's indeed the case, but let's just say for now that is the case. Then we say, how does that impact society? Well, we could say that, to allow the apartheid flag gives us a sense of, it wasn't, it's not something that's bad or illegal. In a way, that sort of promotes the, it sort of makes apartheid a bit more okay, which is obviously white superiority, right? So you see how we could say, well, there's a general sense now of it actually becoming, so there's a general sense of this action actually making white superiority more powerful. Now there's, now people seem to think it's okay. So the actions that you do are things which impact society. So in that way, it's like this little, almost like a feedback loop where whiteness engenders whiteness, which engenders whiteness, so to say. But in other words, the way of a society engenders a way of being, which engenders a way of society.
Does the seemingly that let's probably, because I want us to unpack it properly for most people to be able to understand. Let's shift it and move it from an element of individual, so that we can be able to move into the society, and then we can be able to unpack it from that perspective, and then we'll come back into the individual again. If one were to say, if I, as an African, or as a black person for majority of people, I look at an individual, let's say Greg, and I project and I say, the way that Greg does things, and he embodies, let's say, for instance, I say he embodies whiteness. And already you have said that sometimes whiteness is about the structural composition of the society, but also it is how the individual perceives or relates into the world. Now, let's get into the relation of an individual into the world. In post-apartheid South Africa, how do you see and think of white people as individuals? How do they relate themselves into this whiteness that tends to be engendered with this white superiority complex?
Yeah.
You've made examples, but just drive me on the individual element, because some people say, I was not there during apartheid. I did not benefit from apartheid. I did not benefit from colonialism. So why must I therefore be held ransom?
Why am I
on the
a white?
Yes.
Yeah.
So can you take me through that?
Okay. Yeah. Brilliant. So well. Okay. So this is my area of focus. I'm really interested in whiteness as a way of being, as I've mentioned, and there is one attempt by one, I think I already mentioned, Shannon Sullivan, to make sense of how does this work. I sort of reject some of her ideas, and I say we should look at it through a de Beauvoirian perspective of how it works. So that's not going to make a lot of sense to a lot of people, because not a lot of people have read Shannon Sullivan and Simone de Beauvoir. But so let's explain that. Well, so that's how I'm thinking about whiteness. So if we were about to take it to the individual, what would I say? Okay, so on an individual level, if someone was acting in such a way, right, which was, so not reflected is not the wrong word, but let's say there's an action, right? So let's say you walk down the streets, you're a white person, you're walking down the streets, right, and a black beggar comes up to you, right, and they don't interact with you, but they're walking the opposite way, but they're not going to interact with you. They walk past you, and then you do the thing as the white person where you pat down your pockets to make sure everything's okay, right? Okay, but now let's say then you're still walking across the street and a white person walks past you, also a homeless white person, but you don't pat down your pockets. So, well, what is that? Why have you perceived one as the dubious other? Right, because we can see in that treatment, when you pat down your pockets, there's sort of an assumption of, well, they might have done something without me seeing. They might have tried to steal my things. So there's an assumption that this person is morally dubious, but you don't make that assumption about the white person who's also homeless, and that we can then say, okay, so there's some sort of perhaps racial, profiling, or there's a racial response happening here, because you seem to associate this black person with a moral dubiousness, but not the white person, when they both look to be the same sort of, they both are homeless, they both are
in the class, probably one way to say they belong into the same class.
Yeah, if you wanted to be Marxist, exactly, right? But obviously we're going to move a bit away from Marx here, but so there's a bit of racial disclosure there. So now we still almost ask, okay, well, can we expand that? And to take it on to the individual level, I would say, the way I like to write about it is the racial nature of society, right? Where, you see books and films like, for example, The Heart of Darkness, which used to be, I think, an IEB book. There's some serious racial undertones there about, I think perhaps a white savior complex in there, but definitely deeper South Africa. Okay, well, so now we have media and other things like that with these racial associations. So as you sort of grasp that, right, you sort of learn this perhaps way of being. And here's a fun example. Well, not fun, but one of my more interesting examples. We often hear about how in schools there's a code of conduct, right?
Yeah.
And I've read a whole bunch of some reports, some papers on these codes of conduct, and generally the consensus is that we don't say race, but basically you can't have exotic hair, right? And And then what it requires is, you can't have braids or such like that.
A certain type of hair.
But if you have hair which is generally white hair, not like the color white, but like European hair, it's combed back or whatever, it's fine. So okay, well, let's think about that. But in a way, it seems that these in a way that almost postures the white person to be more at home in a school environment. Why?
Okay.
Well, because their hair is more readily accepted than non-white people, right? They might have to spend more time. So even something like that could create a racial association, right? Because now that might create the association of the white as the academic.
I see.
Do you know what I mean? So now, as these racial associations are passed out and one sort of interprets them, that's as one begins to grasp their body, the perspective from which they grasp it is given to them through these medias, through these various forms. And as they grasp their body in this or that way, it starts to engender a certain way of projecting their self into the world, because they don't encounter their body as a body, which might not make sense. But let me put it this way, right? If you think about your body, I think that we don't necessarily say, we don't understand our body as this like separate object. There's almost no question of it necessarily being a body, but it's so much this thing charged with meaning. So you experience the meaning not more than the thing. Obviously, you still understand your body and body. It's very hard to explain this without resorting to hardcore phenomenology. But but the point is that the body charged with meaning is almost what forms your perspective on the world. In other words, that engenders your attitude, your outlook, your way of relating, the way you disclose things. So what I'm saying
does that imply that that already defines you as an individual, including how you relate to the world? When we talk the world, the things outside of your body, your friends, your people that you see. Mm-hmm.
That's literally, well, it doesn't imply it, because that's exactly what I'm trying to say.
Okay,
more strongly than implies it. That's exactly it. So so you're through these various medias and cultural scripts and institution and disparities, one sort of might grasp the idea that the white is associated with like the European superior master.
I see.
And and then what they think, right, is a bit different. How they see things, how they relate to things, right? And Simone de Beauvoir she develops a way of speaking about femininity as something which is engendered by the society, and she says, it's not. It is the society which engenders it. But at the same time, she also thinks there's a degree of freedom here. So while yes, this thing is engendered by society, well, this way of thinking and relating becomes sedimented, right? It becomes something that becomes so background and starts to inform our judgments, so to say, that it becomes very hard to pick it out. But at the same time, there is also a freedom. There is also the case that you could, if you could somehow be aware of these things, which you can be, you could try to work to unsediment your whiteness. So in other words, what I'm saying is, right, society, the racial nature of society, of a white superiority society, such as post-apartheid South Africa, where we see racial disparities, where we see in schools, we hear incidents of racism all the time. I mean, there was that Belinda Magor incident, which we don't have to think too hard about. The Afri-Forum thing, which I've cited. So we have this, and it seems to engender this idea, this way of grasping the body. And as you grasp the body, your perspective correlates, because as that perspective you have grasped your body from becomes more and more sedimented, and it becomes more and more sedimented as you continue to disclose the world, or it's continually engendered through, disappropriations, rewards, or punishments, or some such, then what happens is you start to sort of take up the world in this way which we call whiteness. So then you start to disclose the value of public safety during those riots in a racist way. The way you move towards those values, even the values you can think about, suddenly becomes racially charged. And that's sort of, so that's...
Before that, does that therefore make one to say that it was not my choice to to be racist? Does that make one to be not to can they be justified when they say, I did not choose to be a racist, but I am a racist, or I am using my ways of being in lines of whiteness because I did not choose to operate within this framework.
So that's exactly why I reject Shannon Sullivan, who I mentioned earlier, because I actually think she wants to avoid that. But because of how she construes unconscious habits, I actually think that she ends up with a perspective of the whites just sort of doing racially charged things in the same way that, you know, a conveyor belt makes something. You know, I have a funny idea of writing in my master's. According to Shannon Sullivan, you could sneeze in a racist way, but the point is, you know, it shouldn't be this like habitual thing. It should be, you know, because the problem you've highlighted is exactly it. So that's why, again, this is why I'm appealing to de Beauvoir, because she's an existentialist, so she thinks there's freedom. So yes, your facticity can weigh you down, right? But you aren't just that. You know, you can be a bit more than that, and that gives me room to root the responsibility for whiteness onto the person who's actually doing it, even though it's sedimented and thus probably not so conscious. Because again, I do think one can be racist in an unconscious way. Yes, that's possible. But even so, it's still up to you to realize that. And I don't want to sound a bit like Jordan Peterson, because I obviously despise that man. But it's up to you when you realize it is to change, right? So then we say, okay, well, if my whiteness is sedimented, white superiority is sedimented, how do I change it? Well, you have to unsediment it. How do we do that? Well, that's part 2 of my work, which I've still yet to deal with. But one good way, which I agree with Shannon Sullivan for once, is that you can disrupt whiteness by changing your environment, doing things you wouldn't necessarily do normally, if that makes sense.
Okay.
For her, she thinks that makes enough of disruption in your way of being to make your racist ways obvious. However, I think that a disruption of your environment could refer to, for example, the Western Cape Education Department has a racially disparate pattern of funding. Okay, well, that's something which you can clearly change, right? That's something that you can change. I'm almost suggesting you take responsibility. Well, I am suggesting you take responsibility for your whiteness, but then you work such that being physically white doesn't necessarily mean you are now racist, because you can make the context. Remember that the society is what engenders this whiteness through its medias and whatnot. So if we disrupted that, well, then we could change it such that whiteness doesn't have white racism, which white people tend to take out and live out, right? Whiteness could refer to something like, I don't know, you know, eating roast beef and Yorkshire pudding for Sunday lunch, or something innocuous. You know, it can still be a way of disclosing, a way of projecting yourself into the world, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a racially charged way of doing so. And that could happen at least if we change the environment which engenders it.
So here you are therefore saying we moved from the perspective of how an individual and how it is engendered by the society, and we come back into the individual, but you are then saying we need to disrupt the society so that the individual does not operate within this whiteness that tends to produce white superiority, as one way to understand it. But then for Biko, he says that he talks about liberals, white liberals. He says, go into your own people, change them and fix them, and so that we can be able to, once you're done fixing them, then you can come back and then we can be able to converse. But how do you change the society, Greg, if you have not disrupted yourself in how you think about yourself, the way of being in the world as defined by the society? How do you do that?
There's 2 potential problems which I've yet to deal with. One is a circularity, which I've just realized, is that if you should disrupt whiteness because and if that's something you should do after you've realized that you take up the world in, in a way that we call whiteness, a way that's reflective of white racism. Well, there's a circularity there in that you have to already almost be well, not necessarily, but there's definitely in most cases you have to be ready to acknowledge your whiteness before. So there's a bit of a circularity because you have to already acknowledge your whiteness in order to then go and fix your whiteness. But fixing your whiteness means to disrupt yourself. So it's so it becomes perhaps not a circularity, but a feedback loop. There's definitely a loop of some kind, and it might be circularity. So the second thing is, well, how do we disrupt? If we're disrupting ourselves, why are we trying to disrupt, the world? How does that actually affect ourselves? Well, I think there are a lot of ways wherein you can disrupt the self by disrupting the world. But again, perhaps you have to really be committed to it. So there is the question of commitment. But one way of disrupting the self, it could be, you could try perhaps when you do something to think, okay, why have I done it in this way? What is this desire? Is this desire, or is this action I've done? Have I understood or perceived things in such a way that's informed by a white racism in some way? There is that reflective component to it as to how the self through disruption. So disruption isn't the only way, right? So disrupting the society is one way you can fix whiteness. But at least it's a way of fixing whiteness from being engendered further on. But there's still the question of how do you disrupt yourself? Well, I think I guess there's a few ways, right? I think a lot of the times, if you sort of changed up the media you consume, the books you read, right? I think that could be quite a good thing, So for example, if you read from certain writers of certain perspectives, then you might think, okay, I should try to read other writers with different perspective. I'm not saying you should. Okay, so what I'm saying is you definitely should not go, well, I'm just going to stop reading white males, because there's a lot of problems with that. One of the problems is that if racism is very hard to detect by white people, and white people decide to stop reading books by white males, then it suddenly becomes a question of, well, how do we know what racism is doing to stop it? But okay, so that aside, there is another. The point is the perspectives I would say you need to read as many perspectives as you want from different perspectives, and I think fiction, especially sort of more metaphysical novels, more like things which are considered, things which might be considered like classics, are quite a good example, because you think, why are they good? What are we supposed to take away from this, and how can we reconfigure it? And when I spoke earlier about whiteness, that's exactly why you should read as widely as you can, right? Because whiteness in South Africa is probably different to whiteness in America, so to say. So to know what to disrupt, you need to sort of, you need to know what to disrupt. So you need to almost, I don't know, this, I've still not worked this particular part out, as we can see, but yeah.
So basically what you're thinking about is that even the disruption itself, because how this whiteness tends to manifest, it emanates from the mind. And therefore, even when you are disrupting it, you need to disrupt it from the mind. That's what I'm picking from that.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
I've got somebody here who has a question. It's Brad Sklanders. Brad Sklanders. I'm not sure if I'm not pronouncing the surname well. I'm sorry, but the question is, it says, you have this way of whiteness and you find the way to disrupt yourself, but how do you stop others that are seeing you as white? I think there's two things here. Ne? There's two things that are happening here. Well, the last part is talking about yes, please.
So the thing which because this reminded me, the thing when I spoke about a society engendering whiteness, the process of racialization. When someone treats you as white, that's one way of it being engendered into you, right? So another good way of thinking about Brad's question is, how do you stop others from racializing you as white and thus engendering that whiteness? because I think that's sort of the element. So how do you have this way of whiteness, but how do you stop other people from, engendering it, from perpetuating it, which is a good question, right? So, well, I guess there's a few ways. There were, okay, I can think of a few experiences which I've been in where I think to myself, okay, that person definitely said this thing because I'm a white person. If I wasn't white, there's no way they would have said that, right? There's literally no way. And in that situation, this is just one example. In that situation, perhaps the way is to and if you're like me and you're very contrarian, you'll have some fun with this. You can say, why did you say that? Is it because do you think why do you think I'm okay with something like that being said? Is that really okay? I mean, and
I know you, and I know you tend to say that, and you'll be like,
yeah, I do.
For you tend to say that. But what I love about Brett's also question, which also has got some element of a problem from me, is that the placing together of whiteness as an attitude, the way of being, seeing, and viewing the world, with the racial classification of an individual. Because for some people, they argue that whiteness does not necessarily require a white person for it to be expressive of itself. It can always be expressive outside of a white racialized individual. But also at the same time, in the case of a racialized white person, how do you then solve that particular problem? So I'm problematizing the question in a certain way, that sometimes you must not only understand that whiteness's manifestation is only going to happen because there is a white person in the mix, but there is a black person who can perpetuate whiteness. And therefore, for Brett, he's probably looking at the person who is white, and therefore how do they stop that particular whitenessing coming from the other person to that person who is white. I think that's what I've picked up there.
So I think that's good. So there's two good reasons I think that's a good question. So the first is, okay, so if whiteness is engendered, if whiteness as a way of being is only engendered by a society which is composed of white racism, then why did it come up in the first place? How did this white racism come up in the first place? And who is the guy who is engendering it, right? Because what you want to sort of ask yourself is okay, so if it can only come about because white racism already pervades society's structural composition and is in various forms of like media associations, significations, signifies values, and so on, attitudes, fears, and desires. Well, okay, so where did those come from in the first place? And also, why did they come from? Why did they arise in the first place? Now, that's something that Shannon Sullivan, who I am very critical about, cannot tell me, and that's something which I take her up on, because she can't explain that. However, if we use the existential way, well, that seems it becomes a lot more explainable. Not necessarily why someone would be racist, but we can definitely explain it existentially as well. White racism is something which has been elaborated by someone, right? But that allows us to say that white racism and thus whiteness can actually occur without someone already being composed in such a way which reflects white racism. So that eliminates that circularity there. Then the second thing you say is, okay, so we need to be careful. Perhaps a black person could racialize a white person, and well, of course, the answer is absolutely yes. That's very possible. But my focus is more sort of intra-white, whites and white, because of that thing where he says, you know what, whites, you go and fix the white racism in your society. You do that. So that's sort of why I've ignored that, because of course,
I see. I understand.
Yeah.
Understood. And thank you, Brett, for that question. If there's a follow-up that you want to make up, please, you can make it up and bring it on. Any other person who wants to point out something with Greg or me or any comment or question, we are still welcome. Greg,
even if it's negative, please.
Everything,
in fact,
anything.
If it's negative, I encourage it. I want people to say, Greg, you're wrong because of this reason. That's what I want.
Greg, there is an issue of gated communities in South Africa, especially in the post-apartheid South Africa, and especially in the suburbs. You find these areas where there's these gated communities, and there always is an issue around the protection of a society because there's high crime rates and everything else. And you know me, I've always said that I don't understand whether there is a guilt that is intertwined to whiteness that makes white people to want to close themselves off into a particular society, into a particular corner, because they want to, there's a guilt first. Secondly, there's this superiority complex that makes them to want to close them off, or also whether they just want to take everything that they have already acquired over the years and not share it with anybody. And would that element of gated communities be part and parcel of how you view whiteness in your work that you are thinking about, in your work that you are researching about? Are you thinking around those things as some of expressions of whiteness in post-apartheid South Africa?
So I haven't looked at gated communities specifically, but it's a good suggestion, and I'll tell you why it makes sense. Is that okay? So let me just clarify this. So being white, having the skin tone white, does not necessarily mean you will be a white racist, right? In other words, whiteness does not necessarily have to be composed of white racism. But because the society which engenders it is a white racist society, because it thus in other words, because the society which you find yourself in is full of white racial categories, signifiers, desires, and so on, well, it will then engender a white racism, right? So whiteness could be something different depending on the state of affairs of the society. But then, now we have a state of affairs where a lot of people are in gated communities. And perhaps one expression of whiteness, you say, is a guilt in sort of this like not sharing, in sort of having perhaps too much, correct? That's sort of I think that's what you're saying. So, yeah. Okay. So if we look at where the European master narrative came from, which apparently has shifted according to Melissa Stein, but not that much. It's almost, I think what she's saying is another manifestation of that narrative. But that narrative, and especially this is traced by Charles Mills in The Racial Contract, that whiteness was, before race, it was the other guys. It was me, the Greeks, they were the Greeks. And if someone was not Greek, well, then they were not they were not a person. The Romans, they were Romans, but if you were not Roman, if you were a foreigner, that's terrible, right? So the Roman is the absolute, the other is the foreigner, and that's sort of, especially with the exploitation of the New World, so to say, that otherness, that I think it's something. Okay, I can't remember the name now. It's Latin, but basically like man of the woods, or the way the country is, it's blank slate, tabula rasa. So that sort of otherness became built into this narrative, right? Because we had this otherness, and then it was like, okay, well, I suppose one way, you could use religion, but the problem with religion is that if someone converts religion, well, then they're no longer exploitable, right? Because they just converted to the religion which only like the civilized, so to say, are a part of. So race takes on this category of otherness, except it just finds a way to make it more binding, because it's a lot easier to convert religions, or I don't know, that's probably a problematic statement, but it's probably at least not as hard to convert what religion you are as opposed to converting what race you are. That's probably a lot harder if it's even possible. So, and there's lots of problems with that. So okay, so now this otherness component gets built as like a hard way to wire race. So whiteness isn't necessarily just about the absolute. It's also about there's these other, the other guys, and well, I say guys, but it would be the other non. So is there this guilt? Well, it's certainly these communities, especially gated community, which is just whites. It's certainly a manifestation of a white group shutting itself and thus defining others, right? So here, where these people of this socioeconomic class. So if you want to be Marxist in a way, you could say, well, let's say that whiteness was to occupy a certain socioeconomic class, which I don't think entirely works for South Africa because, I think there is racially mixed socioeconomic classes. Mm-hmm. So, but let's just say that was the case. Then you could say, yes, well, these people live in this, these people of this socioeconomic class live in this state. So it tends to be a manifestation of that. But even though it isn't as clear cut as that, I do think that since, at least where I'm from in the Midlands, a lot of gated communities are just whites. So if that's the case, okay, well, it certainly seems like there's a sort of a sense of we're closing ranks and we're shutting others out. So it might be a guilt in that, we acknowledge that the others don't have what we have because that's what it is. The other is what you aren't, right? The other is your negation. Yeah. So there is that sense of, well, the other is my negation, which means they don't have what I have. So there is a sense of I do have more than them. But instead of at least manifesting that as a guilt, I guess it's a denial of guilt by saying, okay, they are my negation in that they don't have the opportunities I have. So what am I gonna do with that? Okay, build a big fucking wall. That's what I'm gonna do. So instead of using that as a at least there you go. Instead of disclosing that factoid, that fact of they are my negation, instead of disclosing it in a guilty way, you disclose it in a racially charged way. In a way,
okay.
Yeah, you say that's actually perfect. The gated community in that way is almost a racially charged disclosure because that other must be kept out because they're the other. So you disclose the space, these people, and those around you in a very racially charged way. At least we could argue that with a bit more elaboration. But
I see.
Yes.
I see. Thanks for that. We've got some interaction that is taking place that I would like you to engage on. Yes. We've got some comments, and I would be happy that if you can take them through. Do you feel that there is a bad middle ground in the white community where people aren't explicitly racist but still benefit from their whiteness and don't want they don't want there to be change, to be the change of the status quo? I think that there's an additional there. So I'm putting it here. Try and answer this one. There's another one that is going to come through from Christine. So let's start with Jethro and hear what you have to say on this.
So I mean, there certainly is. Okay, so this is the problem with being a Marxist about race. I think is that you don't get the nuances of the differences within a socioeconomic class. So let's say a bad middle ground in the white community. Well, yeah, there certainly are people who are white who they aren't explicit racists. They operate without saying any racial slurs, but there's a sense of so let's say they have a black domestic worker. Okay, well, let's say they seem quite aggressive or hostile, or maybe they speak in a very condescending way. There definitely seems to be something wrong there. And perhaps if we knew a bit more, we could say, yeah, well, because they are operating from the perspective of that the white is the superior educated master and the non-white is the other, is the opposite. So perhaps that's at stake at work in that dynamic. Okay, so let's say that's at work in the dynamic. Now this person is operating this way, but they don't want whiteness is a structural composition. In other words, they don't want a society which privileges whites at the expense of non-whites to change, right? They don't want that, but they aren't explicitly racist. And well, of course that exists, right? I think that definitely exists. So Biko.
So it does not make them less racist, though. If one were to say.
It just makes them lying bastards. Yeah. So Biko, you know, he talks about race. Because he says the white liberals, right? There's that passage where he says, I think he says something. I think he says something to the effect, you know, black man, the white has kicked you and told you how to respond. Well, the liberals, they invite you over for tea. Look how not racist I am. You know, I've had struggle leaders over for tea, and then you see them. And they actually don't want to change the status quo, right? He says, you know, you ask one of those liberals, they say, what can we do? You say, well, you know, give up your privileges. And they say, no, we don't want to do that. That's ridiculous, right? Well, that's exactly it, just in the modern day, right? We have people who might not be explicitly anti-racist or racist, but they are certainly, you know, profiting.
They're benefiting from the racist benefits, the racist outcomes.
Yeah, exactly. As well as engaging in a way which reflects a white superiority in terms of sedimented signifiers, fears, desires, and whatnot. And we say, okay, but they don't want it to change. Well, of course that exists. You know, I can't name. I'm not going to name names because that's legally.
No, don't do that.
I'm kidding. But
don't do that.
No. Well, of course it exists. You know.
We've got another question. Thanks, Jethro. I hope you are happy with that response, even if it's not sufficient. If it is not, we've got Christine, who also raises a question: how do you disrupt the whiteness in your family? How do you get, that is question one, and then two, how do you get them to see their own whiteness? Two, and why is it a problem? Why is it a problem that whiteness? Often older white people get defensive and can't see their privilege. Can you make the comment here? This is Kirsten Mackenzie, probably your relative.
That's my sister, yeah.
Okay.
There we go.
Thanks for being part of this, Kirsten. We appreciate your presence.
So let me start responding by just mentioning that I am aware that my camera and the lighting currently makes me look like the whitest white person on the screen. I'm well aware of that. But anyway, so let's carry on. How do you disrupt whiteness in your own family? So again, that's an incredibly hard thing to do. It's, you know, because in a way, as I mentioned the circularity earlier, a lot of you know, critical race theory, or I wouldn't call what I do critical race theory, but at least a lot of philosophy of whiteness seems to rely on people who are really going to make that change, who are really okay to engage with their whiteness. So, well, how do you do that's step one before you can disrupt whiteness in your family? Well, I think that's an incredibly hard thing to do. However, I do think exposure to obviously destitute conditions and, you know, is very helpful. I think you know, if you read something like this book I read where it explicitly argues that, well, yes, indeed, at Western Cape Education Department there were these racial disparate fundings, right? This is what this book says. That's not what I'm saying. This is what that book says. I'm not going to get illegal here. But anyway, well, you read a book like, you know, you read that and you think, okay, yes, there seems to be something going on here. And I suppose it's almost a game of exposure, perhaps, to get people to want to engage with their privilege, with their whiteness. But then when they've done that, how do you then disrupt it in your family? Well, you know, how does whiteness function in your family? Perhaps there are certain jokes, perhaps there are certain ways of, you know, speaking or saying or treating people which aren't explicitly done with mention to race, but nonetheless are racially charged. Well, I suppose you have to be open to that to be able to point those out, and especially probably engage in a long, frustrating conversation about, you know, with people who are older, to say, well, this is the problem, right? This is why this is a problem. and it can be hard because often those sorts of conversations become quite washed out and becomes awkward, and you don't want to speak about it. So there's almost a sense of you want to be vulnerable so that you can confront things. That's sort of, you want to expose and be vulnerable and be ready to like be beaten down, because obviously people are going to be engaged, in a game of self-defense. So here's one interesting thing. Shannon Sullivan talks about whiteness as unconscious. She says, well, there's an investment. Okay. She does not explain investment in my view, but let's say she does. The only investment she does explain is investment in self-defense. Okay, what does she mean? Well, the unconscious tries to censor your own view of yourself such that your whiteness is not exposed, because you don't want these terrible things about you to become known, right? What I mean is, you don't want your sense of self doesn't want to be exposed to the fact that, in fact, you have privilege, you have this privilege, and it's quite a hard thing. So someone might say, I've worked really hard for this or that, but perhaps in their mind, their mind is doing a bit of unconscious trickery to make them think that, so that they don't have the hurt of realizing, okay, well, I've actually been quite privileged and it's been at the expense of others. So perhaps that's something. But okay, so that's one thing you might be up against. But again, even if it is an unconscious process, even if it is a self-defense mechanism, it's still probably going to require exposure and a long conversation, which really repetitively like explains and outlines just how one is being racist, so to say.
And I think this aspect that Christine is asking about, especially when she says that at some point they can't see their privilege. Maybe it is that unconsciousness. It is that unconsciousness where they have been, they have perceived they are being in the world, is what makes them to unsee that privilege, because they are always white, or they are always within a white grouping. But if they were to be in an environment where there is the other who doesn't have the same privileges as they are having, probably they would understand this element. And thanks for that. Thanks for that outlook as well. We are going to be going to just the last part of our conversation, and I'm going to be throwing some straight and direct questions that can be a little bit uncomfortable for some people. Do you do you believe that all white people are racist?
Okay. So I think that if I was to take my own idea seriously, it would be hard to say that no white person is not racist, right? I think that and here I agree with Shannon Sullivan, since we live in a society where race, in South Africa, it's very hard not to be aware that you are white, right? I think it's very hard not to be aware that you are white, and 20 something years ago that would have meant that you are very much in the you very much receive the benefits which are gained by exploiting others, right? So but now, okay, while the apartheid regime might not necessarily be a part of South Africa, post-apartheid South Africa, we still operate with race, and we still operate with a very we still operate with race, and we still operate with a lot of racial signifiers and desires and so on. So okay, so if those things are still operative in South Africa, well, then you would probably find it's very hard, if we take my appropriation of Simone de Beauvoir seriously, it would be very hard for someone not to have developed this way of disclosing the world, which is, reflective of a white racism. But, not every white person is a Ku Klux Klan member, not every white person wants to go to Oranje. But at the same time, there are white people who want to go to Oranje. So what I'm saying by that is, there are degrees of racism, and perhaps no one is entirely devoid of racism. And that's probably just, that's just the fact of what we're looking at. No one's devoid of racism. However, that should not mean that it's okay, right? Just because
I see.
Yeah, just because you might find that it's very hard to not be racist. That does not mean it's okay. In fact, that means that there's an even more pressing game at hand here, because now we're totally fucked, because now it's not even up to you apparently. So now you really have to care, right?
Greg. There's people who are talking. There are people who are talking on the line. I know that the conversation is supposed to be 1 hour. What do I do? What do I do? There are people who are talking on the line, and they are talking to you. And I've got three comments here that are directly specific to you. What do I do? Do we go to the final close and close the session, or do you want us to get to these comments?
Let's get to. Should we do the comments? Because I guess that's
Yeah, let's do the comments, because they are here, and try and be as brief as possible, and be as clear as you can be. Jethro is able to is saying, I'm confused by they and other. Remember earlier we were talking about this dynamic of they and other. Can you just clarify that when we were talking about the othering and the they?
So they and other, it's quite a philosophical tradition, perhaps, where you have the other. So I am Greg. Okay, anyone who is not Greg is the other. In other words, they are not me. What do I mean by that? Okay, well, what I mean by that is they are, they're different to me. They aren't me. They're not the same as me. They don't see things in the same way. And who is they? Well, they in this context is, the absolute, the people who are in charge. So in that case, the other would be, the inessential, apparently. And of course, when I say that, I'm speaking from the perspective of the they, because you have to remember this is something we use to describe the European master narrative and so on. So they is typically, the essential. Think of it in this way. Who is they and other in the context of white racism? Well, they are the absolute essential white, and the other is the inessential non-white. That's sort of the idea when you operate with the they and other. The other is not me. They are different from me. I can do whatever I want to them because they're different from me. I don't have any moral obligations to them. So that's one way of understanding they and other. I hope that sort of clarifies it. I think it does. But...
Yeah, and at the same time, Jethro was happy that you are not trapped in generalization. So that's good. Big ups. Here is another question that is coming. Atwell Kwangwa, he says, Sobukwe denounces the use of color in human beings as being whites, black, and whatever the case might be, pink or whatever, and prefers that we see each other as one human race. And in our case, as Africans, that means, and now what is Greg's attitude towards Sobukwe's assertion of denouncing the coloring of a human being?
I think it's incredibly naive in post-apartheid South Africa, because let me explain. Steve Biko says, right? He says, what is integration in apartheid? Well, it's not integration, it's assimilation. What is the difference? Okay, integration, we are exchanging, we are building something totally new together, right? So there's an interaction. Assimilation is you must be the same as me. You have to conform to my ways. And that would ignore the power dynamic of a racially disparate system, a system where being white means that you have certain privileges. So if we were going to say, well, why can't we just call ourselves South Africans? Well, the reason is because race is still very much something which is a part of your opportunities, how you see things, and not because of some essential biological quality, but because race, at least when I talk about whiteness, it's engendered by the society, the way you see things, how you would think, what you would think to think, what you do, how you relate, that's engendered by the society. Also your opportunities, what opportunities are open to you might depend on race, as I think we can say in South Africa it does, because there is, for example, I did look last year, but let's hope that's recent enough. Last year there was a disparity. There was more young white males employed than non-white males. So so even that we could say, well, race seems to correlate to something here. So if we were going to say, okay, well, I'm not white, I'm South African, it would, especially if a white person does it, because it's really, and this is why, it would ignore the fact that I have not only benefited from some exploitative system, which seems to still be in place, right? Because we can refer to things like the employment statistic, but also it also seems to ignore that I might have been racialized as white and thus have this white way of seeing the world. Right, it might ignore that, like, the medias and how I've been treated, the various like signifiers and stuff I've been exposed to has now become a part of me. So if we ignore that, then suddenly white racism perhaps slips under the rug again, and it continues to operate without real chance of actually, finding and uprooting it. So I would say
you're saying post-apartheid South Africa and that element of not seeing race and racism and racism is problematic, because already the foundations are race-based. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Here is Brownman. Another comment. There are a lot. Oh, hi, mommy. I didn't know. She's asking, there are a lot of black children adopted by white couples. What do you think these children's identity will be? That's one. Also, will that identity engender whiteness?
Yeah, well, so that's quite hard. So what will their identity be? Well, we can say the parents in that case, perhaps the parents will engender a sense of whiteness into them. But at the same time, when they go off to school and other people, they might be racialized as black. And a really good way to look at this is Fanon, right? I think Frantz Fanon, he moved, I think, from Algeria, comes to France. He did not, he thought he was exposed to all of these racial values. This is Black Skin's White Mask. But he thought of himself as white. However, he also thought of himself such that he detested blackness. And when he goes to France, he realizes through an interaction, he's okay. He realizes he's black, and now he realizes, okay, I'm not only this black object because he's been racialized into an object, but he's also this thing which he didn't like. And when he he's the black other now, and when he tries to go toward his space in the world, it's not there. So that's this triple consciousness people speak of. But basically, what might happen is actually quite a traumatic experience of being both an object and other, and not really having much place. And what I'm not saying is that interracial adoption should be banned. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that interracial adoption presents new challenges, which I wholeheartedly encourage people to think about, because this is, if we're trying, this is part of a more integrated future. So these are new challenges which have to be thought about, and which, we really need to get an answer to. But what exactly would the answer be? Well, the answer certainly would be, and this is going to be a very lame answer, it would be not to engender a sense of whiteness. And you might say, okay, but how do we prevent that?
Well, how do we do that? Yeah.
At least I can say we can disrupt the society. And if you ask me how we must do that, then please read my forthcoming master's thesis.
We'll do that. Yes. We've got the last two. And the last two is again from Brett, and then there will be Atwell. There is a saying that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Would you say that I don't know who's we, but I'm suspecting that he's talking about Brett and others, and probably yourself. We should leave the older generation and focus on the younger generation and teach them the correct way What is your view on this? And you can intertwine this with this particular comment. A question. Is there a reference to whites and non-whites the same as blacks and non-blacks? And maybe you can put that. But before we can go to those, he says that he is totally in agreement with your submission of the previous submission. Thank you, Greg. I fully agree with you. White privilege and black economic subjugation cannot be delinked from the race factor. So let's talk to those two comments.
Yeah, okay.
New tricks, the old dogs or new. It's unfortunate that this saying talks about old dogs, and we will talk about old people and dogs. Unfortunately, we are not saying that old people are dogs, but it's just the saying. So we must understand it from that dynamic. So make a comment on that and round it up with the second one. Then, unfortunately, we have to talk about it. Oh, Jethro is 75 years old, so that's good. 75 years old, so therefore we are good. I'm happy. So how do we do that?
So okay, so I mean, as I'm sure everyone can tell, and this is the classic thing to say in philosophy, it's very messy and nothing is simple. But okay, so what do we do about the older generation? Well, the older generation are still, we still have moral obligations to the older generation, right? So I suppose one way of saying is that, like, well, the older generation, especially as people who are still, they still interact with others, so they can still engender whiteness, right? It can still be part of this perpetuation. So we definitely should at least, it might be hard because these views are more sedimented in people who have grown and lived them out longer. But we should definitely still try. However, there is obviously the factor of a young person might have views which are not as sedimented as an older person, so it would be a good place to at least start with them. However, we shouldn't abandon those who are over a certain age limit, because there's still people who are still active in society and still part of it. And to tie that with the other comment, so when I say non-whites and when I say whites and non-whites, that reference is, well, it could be the same as blacks and non-blacks. So in one sense, Steve Biko does use blacks and non-blacks to both refer to people who are physically black, but he uses more as a way to distinguish between two people who are like committed to black consciousness and who aren't. But at least in my context, it would probably be the same. However, the reason I say whites and non-whites is because I'm trying to capture it from the white perspective. So because it's a phenomenological account, an existential account, I'm trying to make it as close to white cognition as possible. So that's why I frame it like that. Of course, what I'm not saying is that we should whites non. I'm not saying that at all. That's a problematic statement in itself. But just for now, I'm using it in this framework. I think it's to comment on white racism by using its own terms.
I see, and thank you very much, my friend Greg, for this submission. And we've had this. I was so astonished. I was so surprised when Jethro said he's 75 years old. Look at the last comment that Jethro sent through. I have been an open-minded human being since the age of 10. No education was necessary to steer my attitude. It was just that I had to do, and I had to learn and had a specific attitude. Greg, my friend,
yes.
Closing remarks. Anything from your side? We're closing now.
Do you know what? I think you'll remember this from when we were at Tux. I always think of how when we were doing Biko with Lamola, how he ended it. He was like, and basically we're all fucked, but we should still try. Like, yes, yeah. I think that's the good way of putting it.
Yeah, thank you very much, my friend, for being part of this conversation. I hope that the people who have been watching with us and those who have gotten something out of this conversation. It was it can be messy at times, but it can also be fascinating at times. For those people who are watching, I'm sure they are glad that you made this submission, and I'm glad that you made this time and be part of Pond the Politic. I appreciate you. And I loved every moment. I loved every moment. People are saying, well done to you, very insightful. You have done a great thing. I just want to make sure that I play these comments for everybody so that you can see them. Good point on reading. My teenage years were influenced by the Bible. This is beautiful. People are making and are congratulating for your submission. Greg, my friend, thank you very much. We are in a post-apartheid South Africa, and I'm glad. You can see that I decided today to wear my Biko T-shirt so that we don't forget.
That's good. That's good. There we go. Okay, well, thank you.
I loved every moment. Greg, all the best. Thank you very much, my friend. Good luck. Brilliant. And bye-bye.
Thank you. You too. Cheers.
Bye. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope it was a wonderful show, and I loved every moment. And thank you again with your comments. Thank you, and go back and look at this discussion. Go back and look at this conversation, and spread it outside there. Make sure that it is part and parcel of the conversations that are in the public domain. Let us not be afraid of confronting these realities. The politics purpose is that we should not hide or run away from specific conversations. We don't do any superficial analysis. We make sure that we confront everything accordingly. I hope that you had enjoyed. If you did enjoy, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to have all of you to be part and parcel, and put on the notification so that you can be part of the conversations. There are different conversations. They are wonderful. You can go back up until the first day we started. The conversations that we've had are great conversations, very informative. No platform provides such great conversations as Ponte Politique. Appreciates your presence, appreciates your being part of this conversation. Let's see each other again next week on Sunday at 6 o'clock. Bye-bye. All the best.